7
Test, test, test. Good morning, everyone. I'll use my outdoor voice.
Here, Bart.
Oh, you know what?
You want this one?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Oh, all this technology. Now we're good. Can you hear me now? Good. Welcome to our ZED Talk today. We are going to get started. We had some jazz liturgy this morning in worship. That means that the right-brained artistic folks were in charge, and so timing was out the window this morning. So, no, it's great. We are so delighted to have Deanna Thompson here, Dr. Deanna Thompson from St. Olaf, newly at St. Olaf College. She is, I have to get this right, the director of the Lutheran Center for Faith, Values, and Community, and the Martin Marty Regents Chair in Religion and the Academy at St. Olaf. And she is here to talk to us about illness, trauma, and getting to hope through her own research and her own experience, I imagine. And we're delighted to have her. Let's welcome her as we begin.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to tell you how I got to this topic, and it starts with, unfortunately, me getting sick. And in 2008, I broke my back in a mysterious way and had a bunch of tests, and they couldn't determine what was wrong. And so I was wearing a full torso brace from here to here. And they said, well, typically people fall off a roof to break their back, but it must be a fluke. So I continued on with my life of teaching, and then right before Thanksgiving, this was all fall, I kind of had this happening, and then right before Thanksgiving, got out of the car at work, and a lot of pain going up my left side, and in the fall I was on Vicodin every night to help me sleep because of the pain in my back. But then over Thanksgiving, I was using Vicodin 24/7 because it was so painful. And then right after Thanksgiving, on my 42nd birthday, I went in for another MRI, and a second vertebra had broken. And they said one vertebra breaking could be a fluke, but two vertebrae, especially when you're wearing a brace, not a fluke. So they biopsied fluid on my back and found that it was stage 4 breast cancer that had spread to my bones. And this is a very serious diagnosis. It's incurable. And most people who have what I have are dead within 5 years. But I have been doing incredibly well. And yay for me, but really awful for most people who have what I have. And so I'm in my 12th year of living with this, and I'm in my 3rd remission. And I'm a religion professor, a religion scholar, and I say I get paid to talk about God. But after the cancer came, words went away for a while. I didn't have a lot of words for what was happening to me. I didn't understand breast cancer breaking my back. That was on a lot of opioids. It was hard for me to understand a lot of things, and really words went away. And so part of kind of getting words back was I wrote a kind of theological memoir in 2012 called Hoping for More, and it was figuring out kind of what words to use to talk about this diagnosis that upended my family's life and upended my life. And so over the past 11 years, I've been thinking, speaking, and writing about what this life is like. One of the chapters in the memoir was called Embraced by the Virtual Body of Christ. And one of the shocks of getting sick for me is I was a digital skeptic. I didn't own a cell phone. I was very self-righteous about not having a cell phone or not being on social media. My kids didn't have cell phones. And then when I got sick, my world went from being very lively and out in the community a lot to really constricted, the oncology clinic or the 4 walls of my house. And one of the big shocks for me was my brother started a Caring Bridge website the day I got diagnosed, and I experienced the hands and feet of Christ kind of supporting me through that website. And that has led me to think a lot about and now write a book about what it means to be the church in the digital age and helping us think about how we can use these digital tools like our phones, like sites like Caring Bridge. How can our churches use these tools to better be the body of Christ to one another? So that's what I talk about a lot these days as well. And then about 6 years ago or so, I have a friend who teaches at Boston University. Her name is Shelley Rambo, and she works on trauma and religion. And she asked me to become part of a project that became this book called Post-Traumatic Public Theology. And she is looking at, in this book, she had about 12 of us come together and think about how trauma is related to things like veterans coming back from war, forced immigration, disability, and illness. She asked me to write the chapter on trauma and illness. And before I got asked to write this chapter, I didn't know that there's this whole body of research done by the medical profession and psychologists and psychiatrists about illness-related trauma. And that set me on a new path because when I started reading this literature about illness-related trauma, I was amazed at how much it helped me understand what it was like to live with incurable cancer. And I thought, why have I been living with this for 7 years and not a single person has talked to me about trauma? And so one of the missions I have now is to kind of talk about trauma and its relationship to illness in a religious, theological context. So the latest book that I wrote is called Glimpsing Resurrection, Cancer, Trauma, and Ministry. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of some of the insights that I gained through writing that book and share with you kind of some of the arguments, some of the claims I'm making in this book about how, again, we can better support one another when people go through really serious illness. So one of the things I do in the book is I talk about a lot of different people who've lived with cancer. And I'm just going to briefly mention these people. Some may be familiar to you, others may not. Arthur Frank, in the top left, there is a sociologist of illness at the University of Chicago. And at age 39, he had a heart attack and got diagnosed with cancer in the same year. And it's fascinating to read his reflections on how the experience of having a heart attack versus living with cancer went. And his insights are really, really fascinating. Paul Kalanithi, hopefully some of you have read his incredible book called When Breath Becomes Air. And he's the Stanford neurosurgeon who in his 30s got diagnosed with incurable lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, and lived almost long enough to finish the book that now exists called When Breath Becomes Air. Really beautiful, powerful book. Barbara Ehrenreich, bottom left, she has written she's a cultural critic, has written nickel and dimed, written a lot of different social commentaries, and she got breast cancer and then has written and now talks a lot about her experience and what she considers the relentless optimism of American society meets getting cancer and what happens in our really optimistic society when someone has a really serious illness. Carrie Host died of a rare form of cancer after living with it for about 6 or 7 years and wrote a really powerful book. Susan Gubar was a professor of English and got diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer and has been living with that for quite some time, which is quite atypical, and writes for the New York Times on what it's like to live with cancer. Jason Micheli got diagnosed in his late 30s with incurable cancer, and he's a pastor out east and now writes about that. He wrote a book that's actually really awesome, but it has an awful title. It's called Cancer is Funny. I think that was a strategic error on the publisher's part, because I don't know how many of us are going to give this to somebody who is really struggling with cancer, but it actually is quite a wonderful book. Audre Lorde is a poet and a writer who got diagnosed with cancer, breast cancer, in the 70s, and her journals, they're called the Cancer Diaries, cancer journals, are still quite widely read today. Kate Bowler, many of you may be familiar with her. She's at Duke Divinity School and got diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer in her early 30s, and wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, which is a really great title. And she's now has a podcast too, which I would highly recommend, called Everything Happens, thinking about where do we get support, how do we support one another in the worst times of our lives. A few more. Todd Billings got diagnosed with incurable cancer in his 30s, and he's a pastor and a professor, and wrote a book about lament and the power of lament. Christian Wyman is at Yale Divinity School. He too got diagnosed with incurable cancer in his 30s, and wrote a book called My Bright Abyss, which people compare to like C.S. Lewis. It's really, really powerful a book that I recommend to you. And the final one is Camille Scheel, a neighbor and friend of mine who got diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, wrote a book called The Welcome to Camp Chemo, and she passed away a couple years ago. So in the book, I use the stories of these folks, as well as my own stories, to kind of mine them and think about what happens when people get diagnosed with especially advanced stage cancer, incurable illness, and how does that look from the inside out, and then thinking about how can we as members of Christian communities really try and support folks in this situation. So one of the things that became really clear to me, both through my own experience and through really probing other people's experiences, is that I think all of us know that something like cancer is a really serious physical condition. We know that it's a really serious diagnosis. We know that you have to go through really serious treatment for this, that your body often becomes undone. The cancer broke my back, and then I started to have a lot of really intense treatment for that, radiation treatment to try and stop. They thought if it went a few more weeks without treatment, I wouldn't have been able to walk anymore, because it was just eating away at my spine very aggressively. But that treatment then caused me to throw up continuously, and with a broken back, kind of throwing up all the time was really a really horrible experience. I wasn't able to eat anything, right, and it looked like I was dying. So I think many of us know and appreciate the physical toll that getting cancer and then getting treated for cancer often has. But what I think we don't appreciate as much collectively in our society is how when you are undone in your body, yourself is also undone, right? So Susan Gubar, who has stage 4 ovarian cancer, she writes about the tyranny of the body. And so she had to get a colostomy bag, and she said, I couldn't think much beyond stool softeners, right? And I had to have a bathroom always in view. It's when the body just kind of takes over and dominates. And how that really challenges our sense of who we are, right? So I think we really appreciate that physical toll, but I'm not sure if we always appreciate the psychological toll that really serious illness can have. Secondly, and this is really influenced by Barbara Ehrenreich in particular, but that pressure to tell a positive story about your illness. We talk about cancer in our society typically in battle imagery, right? So you fight valiantly, you beat it, we're gonna beat it. I have a friend whose spouse got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer not long ago. This is one of the cancers that we really can't do a lot about in very meaningful ways and extend the amount of living someone with that disease can have. And initially on the Caring Bridge website, he says the prognosis is not good, but pancreatic cancer has not met my wife. And I thought, that's a hard one, right? And things are not going very well right now. And that's the pressure to kind of be optimistic, to say, and then, you know, in the obituaries when people with cancer die, often it's they lost their battle to cancer, right? And so one of the challenges is, how do you talk about the undoing of yourself? And there's a lot of pressure in our society to talk about it, and well, it's been really tough, but it's better now, or I've overcome it. More and more, many of us are living longer and better with incurable illness. I'm not beating it, but I'm hoping to live alongside it as long as I can. Another important dynamic is the foreclosure of the future. Paul Kalanithi wrote in his book, I went to a class reunion not long after I was diagnosed, he said, and I'm so happy no one asked me about my future plans because I didn't have any. And I got diagnosed at age 42. I didn't realize how many people in my life were so future oriented. When our kids graduate from high school, when I retire, when, in the future, and when you get a really serious diagnosis, that future that looked really expansive suddenly constricts, right? And how do you think about, I didn't know I had a future. And none of us knows exactly our future, but some of us have a lot more confidence in that than others. And lastly, the last kind of theme I explore is this idea of, I think this kind of relates to the pressure to tell positive cancer stories as well, is that there's also pressure to have it make sense, right? That your story needs to make sense. We want to know, how did someone get this particular illness? And some of that is genuine curiosity for them, but some of that you can see is curiosity, like kind of wanting to check off in your own mind, oh, I don't have that family history, so I'm good, right? Why did it happen? And for some of us, there is a clear kind of sense of why a diagnosis would come. For many diagnoses, it's who knows, right? Who knows exactly why this happened? I was a very healthy human being. I worked out 5 days a week. I slept 8 hours a day. I didn't smoke. I didn't drink very much, right? I got incurable cancer at age 42. Kind of challenges that notion of like, take care of yourself and you're gonna be able to live until you're 95, right? I'm not saying there's no relation between how we take care of ourselves and illness, but there's not always a really clear correlation. Christian Wyman, who had this rare form of cancer diagnosis at 39, says, you know, sometimes because of all the suffering I've gone through related to this illness, I'm not sure sometimes that the suffering means anything. So there's a threat to meaning making. Definitely a lot of people who get really ill or have awful things happen to them are able to make meaning and say, kind of, maybe this is how my life makes sense now. But there's a lot of struggle for trying to figure out how to go on. I think the question for me, and when I talk to other people who live in similar situations to me, the main question isn't why. Why did this happen to me? That's really, that doesn't really lead us anywhere. The main question is how. How do we keep living in light of what we're dealing with? So when we think about these dynamics of cancer, and I think this applies in certain ways to other illnesses. It applies to other kind of awful things that we experience in our lives. And so now I want to think a little bit with you about trauma and what trauma is. My friend Shelley Rambo at Boston has, I think, a really powerful definition of trauma. And she says that trauma is the suffering that remains. So there's a death of bodily integrity, or a death of health, or a death of a way of seeing the world through experiences in war or other kinds of traumatic experiences, and you keep living, right? And the suffering that keeps living with you is the trauma. And so there is, as I was mentioning, quite a bit, there's been a lot of research in the past 20, 30 years about trauma in all sorts of different contexts. Unfortunately, being human opens us up to a great possibility of experiencing a lot of traumatic experiences. And specifically, I want to focus on what some of the research says about trauma related to illness. So one of the dynamics for a lot of forms of experiences that lead to trauma is that there is an external threat, right? So if we think about, these are horrible things. I went to a conference a few years ago in Amsterdam called Trauma and Lived Religion, and it was 4 days of listening to people talk about all the horrible things we do to one another as human beings, and how that just compounds for people. And I thought, I'm pretty new to this research, and I thought I couldn't do this research as the only thing that I do in my life. It's so intense. But one of the main things that people talk about regarding trauma, especially in terms of the horrible things that we do to one another, is that the body starts to, this is one of the big issues with post-traumatic stress, is that you have triggers, right, to external stimuli. So maybe it's a sound, like a loud sound, right? If you were part of a war situation and you hear a loud sound, your body is going to react to that external stimulus. And so many people who work with folks who suffer from PTSD today will try to rework the body's responses to those external stimuli. One of the big differences with cancer and other illnesses is that the threat is primarily internal. It's not external. And so some of you may be familiar with the author John Green. He wrote a book called The Fault in Our Stars, which was made into a movie about 2 teenagers who have cancer. And one of the main characters in that book says, so what is, he says, I'm supposed to be at war with my cancer. But what is my cancer? My cancer is me. My cancer is just as much me as my heart and my lungs are part of me, right? And so that internal threat, how do you rewire the body's relationship to a threat that is you, right? And so some people who do research on trauma and illness will say that people who live with chronic and severe illnesses probably can never be post-trauma, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder means you experienced the trauma and now you're post, and now you have to try to deal with that after effect. For people with illness, part of the challenge is that that threat may always be there, right? And of course, and probably this is something that might have attracted a number of you to coming today, that the trauma of illness is not just the person living with the illness, it's also the family, right? It's the spouse or the partner, it's the parents, it's the children. I have 2 children, they were 9 and 12 when I got diagnosed, that's been 11 years ago, we're still really dealing with the after effects of that, especially with our older child, right? So you have trauma extending not just to the person who's ill, but to many people beyond that. So one of the things then I want to think about is what do we do as communities of faith? What do we do as Christians to think about this and to respond to this reality? One of the things for teaching religion many years, one of the things I've told my students is I think one of the main reasons people who are religious is because the religious frameworks that we have in our lives help us make sense of these awful experiences. And then I tell my students, and I think one of the main reasons why people who aren't religious is because those frameworks don't work for them. They don't buy it, right? And so one of the things that I have been interested in doing is to think about ways to make space for trauma and being undone from things like illness that don't kind of fit into a tidy way of explaining or making meaning of what's happening. And I think there's actually a number of places in the Christian story, in the biblical text, that actually make space for living in a place where things don't totally make sense. And I'm not sure that we always really pay attention to those. So I go to 4 different places in the biblical text and kind of explore where does the story, the Christian story, make space for being undone, not having answers, not knowing if there's meaning to be had here. And the first place I go is the Psalms. This is a common place for Christians and Jews to go. But I want to just point out a couple things. The book of Psalms has 150 psalms in it, and 60 of those psalms are considered lament psalms. That means that they are about grieving. They're about being undone. Many Christians go to Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's a beautiful psalm. It was very important to me when I was really, really sick. But I would encourage people to look at Psalm 22 instead of Psalm 23, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is what Jesus says from the cross. I tell my students a more modern translation might be, my God, where the hell are you? I cry out, and you are not there. You are silent. Now that psalm ends with, God has heard my cry, right? A comfort. Most lament psalms end with comfort, but there's one psalm that doesn't. Psalm 88 is the most desolate of all lament psalms. It talks about experiencing a life that's close to death, and it ends with the words, darkness is my only companion. It ends in despair. Now, I'm glad not all lament psalms end in despair, right? But I think it's really, really important that one of them does. Now, I think there's a lot of pressure. One of the things I find talking about this topic with a lot of people is that I have noticed that a lot of people of faith, when their faith is challenged by the awful things that they go through, that they feel a lot of pressure to be confident God is always with them, to be confident God is always at work in this situation, right? And to have a really strong faith. If you read the Psalms, all over the Psalms, it's, God, where are you? I cry out and you are silent. Now, there are rejoinders to that. You have heard my cry. But I think it's important for us to live in that space a little bit and to encourage and point out. What I find is a lot of people end up feeling guilty when they feel like God is absent. It's their fault, right? Their faith isn't strong enough. But if you read the Psalms, you're going to see that some of the most faithful people have experienced that too. And I think that's a really important message. Another place that people go, it's very powerful, very prominent, is the story of Job. I've never actually been a fan of the book of Job because there's a lot of challenges with it. But in this latest book, I feel like I've kind of made peace with this story. And one of the things that happened to me is I started reading Job realizing that looking at it through the lens of illness, one of the things that Job, who's a righteous man, right, he's got everything going for him, he's got this great life, and then everything gets taken away. Well, Job's health also gets taken away. And so to look at Job as somebody who becomes really ill was a powerful kind of rethinking of the book of Job. One of the things that happens is after everything's gone, his friends come toward him, right, and they don't recognize him initially because the grief and the illness has so changed how he looks. A lot of people, when they first saw me after I got diagnosed, you could see my ribs. I looked like I was dying. That experience to me really strongly resonated. Also, one of the things I look at in this story is the relationship between Job and his wife. So the children are taken away, the children die, right? And his wife in chapter 2 says, Job, curse God and die. And he gets really mad at his wife and he says, I'm not going to curse God, right? I'm a faithful man. The next chapter, Job says, I wish I were dead. And one of the things that happens through in that kind of exchange is what happens with so many families when there's a sudden illness. Also when something awful happens, right, in a family, often the spouses or the partners are not on the same page. The statistics for people who get cancer, far more when it's women who get diagnosed with cancer, there's far more divorces when a woman gets diagnosed with cancer in a marriage relationship than if a man gets diagnosed with cancer. One of the things that happens is that the wife kind of goes away from the narrative, and at the end, Job's family, his children, are restored, but there's no mention of the wife. So are they still together? We don't know. We don't hear, right? Often in the Bible, unfortunately, women don't have names. They don't stay with the narrative in the same way. But I think there's some really powerful kinds of imagery around kind of what Job helps us understand about what it's like to go through a really traumatic experience. One commentator on the book of Job was thinking about Job in relation to her illness, and she said, I didn't realize I would lose friends when I got sick, right? So I think Job's story can be really helpful and powerful. The crucifixion, obviously the central place in the Christian story where we talk about suffering. And where I focus here is on Mark's story of the crucifixion. If you know the ending of Mark, there is an original ending to the book of Mark that is where the women go to the tomb to dress Jesus' body and find that the tomb is empty, and they flee in terror. That's actually where the original ending of Mark ends. And then later, what later writers did is kind of add in the resurrection scenes to make it more in line with the other stories that were emerging. Mark is the oldest gospel also that is in the biblical text, right? So there's interesting reflection. Serene Jones, who's written on trauma, she's the president of Union Seminary in New York City. You know, she says, like, what if pastors would let people know that this was the original ending of Mark, that it ended with a traumatic reaction. It ended in ear resolution. And the story doesn't end there right now in how Mark was written. It doesn't end there in the rest of the Gospels. So we don't have to end there permanently, but what if we said this, initially, the followers of Jesus couldn't say more. It was ending in this time of terror, time of uncertainty. And what if we opened that space up and lived there a little bit longer? One of the things that I've also become aware of is that in Christianity, we definitely talk about suffering and sin and hardship, but I think the role of the resurrection, and actually many Jews have commented on this, that Jews tend to live more in the space of irresolution, and Christians tend to need to resolve things. And might that be because we know things are really tough, and then it all gets better. It's resurrection. It's new life. The last space that I look at is the space that I think a lot of Christians really neglect, and that is the space in between Good Friday and Easter morning. And Christians who observe this call it Holy Saturday. And if we look into this sort of thin line of tradition, we see this is where in the creed, right, we say Jesus descended to the dead or descended into hell, right? Jesus dies, descends into hell, and there's a space in between the awful and the resolution, the new life, right? And so Shelley Rambo, other people who work on trauma in Christianity want to think about this place. What does it mean that God goes to hell, right? What kind of possibility is there for us thinking about when we're in that same place? Knowing that God has been there too, what can that do for us? And then I want to say just a couple things about the church. When the church is being the church, I'm the daughter of a pastor, granddaughter of a pastor, 2 uncles, pastors. I think when the church is being the church, there's no better institution that supports people at the worst times of their lives. And I think liturgy, when done at its best, also helps us practice what to say and how to be with people whose lives are undone by awfulness. One of the things Todd Billings, who was one of the authors I pointed to, he has noticed that those of us who follow the lectionary, so my Lutheran church follows the lectionary. Do you follow that here? No? Okay. So, not right now. So the lectionary it's where it sets the readings out for a 3-year cycle. And he's noticed that there are a lot of lament psalms in the lectionary, but they've taken out the most desolate parts. It's like we just can't bear to quite say them. Like Psalm 88, nope, too much of a bummer, right? But actually, I think this idea of we don't know what to say when awful things happen to us. I get a lot of people ask me, what should I say to my neighbor who's lost a child? What should I say to my friend who just got diagnosed? These psalms, they helped me find words when I had no words of my own, right? So how can we as a church be a place that supports and gives space for these awful experiences? And then finally, the Christian story doesn't end in desolation, right? It ends in resurrection and ends in hope. And I'm going to say just a couple things about this because I know our time is shorter today. But this passage from 1 Thessalonians is actually used by a lot of folks who want to talk about the rapture, the second coming of Christ and coming on the clouds and everything. And what I do in my latest book is I kind of think about this passage not really from a rapture perspective, but how does it help us think about the end of life on this earth and maybe life beyond, right? And part of what we have here is that people who have died will be raised, right, to new life. And we don't know exactly what that looks like. Martin Luther said, we know less about the world to come than an unborn child knows as they're still in the womb, right? That didn't prevent Martin Luther from trusting in the promises of God that there is more than just this world. But he was pretty reticent to say much about what that actually looked like. And one of the things that Paul says here is encourage one another with these words, that there is more than just this life. One of the things that I've noticed since being sick is that a lot of contemporary Christians who are not maybe more conservative evangelicals have wanted to shy away from talking about the life to come. we really focus on this world. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. The pendulum, once upon a time, was too focused on the life to come. Your life might be awful now, but good thing you've got the by and by, right? And there's a lot of people who've reacted against that. God wants abundant life for people today, right? But as I've sat in the chemo room for over a decade, I was just there 2 weeks ago, I think that the Christian message has to be more than just today and tomorrow. For some people, there's not much more future in this world, right? And part of the biblical promise is that there is more beyond just this life. What that exactly looks like, I think we can have some good conversations about that. I think I want to be kind of hesitant about what I say. But one of the things we hear in Romans 8, right, is that nothing will separate us from the love of Christ, right? That nothing can separate us, which means not just me, but us. The images of life beyond this one in the biblical text are also corporate. They're communal, not just individual. So these are some of the things that I would love us to be able to talk about, especially with people as they're approaching the end of their life. So that's it for me. But I'm curious about responses, questions, comments. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I'll say one thing. I think our culture wants us to be happy. We talk a lot about how to be
Right,
happy.
right.
But in our paint box, there are dark colors and there are light colors, and we have to use them all. They're just part of our lives.
Right.
And part of every day.
I think absolutely that there are, I mean, all of our lives have sadness in them, and I think there is a kind of real pressure to focus on happiness, to be optimistic. Kate Bowler, who wrote the book Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, studies prosperity theology in the United States, which is thinking that, you know, if you're faithful, God will bless you materially and with health, right? And she wrote, if you're interested just in reading a little piece from her, she wrote a New York Times op-ed called Death, Prosperity, Gospel, and Me. And it's about how she studied prosperity gospel, and then when she got stage 4 colon cancer at 34, when her son was 2, right? She said, nothing in that theology could help me deal with what I was living with. And so part of her approach is really pushing back against that kind of optimism. And I think the Lutheran tradition has a lot of that. The theology of the cross that's kind of, Martin Luther lives with a very strong reality that life is suffering. And yet, there's good news, there's joy, there's more than just that. But taking that really seriously. And I think we, in our society, could do a better job of that. And I think the church is one of those places that can kind of help lead on those issues.
So I'm just making a comment. I
Yes.
think a lot of us who do book lists.
Yeah.
Some great things to dig into. Another comment is that if churches are unwilling to step into this space, then they run the risk of being service.
Yeah, the idea of our, churches being service clubs, churches have a lot of functions, right? But I think this is one that isn't covered by most other institutions in our society don't cover this piece. And I think this is where the church becomes really, really vital. And I think we have a lot of biblical warrants, we have a lot of theological warrant to be in this space. But right, in some ways it's kind of countercultural these days too.
Do you find community within or without the church body of people maybe that they will see it as a role with certain bodies through professional connection?
Yeah.
Someone to physically be with and say,
Yeah.
to be in the
Yeah.
darkness together. Or
Yeah, good question. I mean, in terms of,
we talked about using our
Mhm.
digital.
yeah, good.
So we can maybe find people through the internet that
Mhm.
have
Yep.
things that in common with us that give us a support group.
Right.
In cyberspace, so that,
Mhm.
do you find anything locally that supports your journey?
Yeah, I mean, this question of like where I get support, where other people, I know I have a family member who has a rare illness and has found people virtually online that have the same thing she does, and that just makes such a difference to connect with people who kind of can relate. For me, a lot of it has been other people who are religion scholars who think about some of these issues and then have had this really profound experience of illness. I think there are lots of potential areas of support. For a lot of people, there are support groups that make a real big difference. And so for me, I think a strong network of family and friends, as well as the folks in my professional network that have really been powerful to me. But I think I think one of the things that is important also is to help people find where can they get support, right? And help people kind of discern that, because different people are going to find it in different places. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I appreciate your comments about trauma being internal
Yeah.
and the element of control
Yeah.
and disconnecting from that, and also your reference to treatment being about trauma.
Yeah.
That's a good to help me. Something challenge things helping me
Right.
is stress.
Yeah. I think that's a really hard one. And you hear this from people. The treatment is often harder than they'll say like the diagnosis isn't often what is the trauma, what is traumatic. It's actually what comes after, right? And then it's the undoing of the body, which then is the undoing of the self. And one of the hardest things for me is to be with people right after they're diagnosed, because there is such a resilience. There's a sense of which like, we're gonna fight this, we're gonna get through this, and you know that for most of those people that everything is gonna be stripped away. And it's just, but you can't just say that, you can't be like, that's good you have that attitude, because that's not gonna, it's not gonna get you through, but that for me is a really hard moment to watch, because it's such a natural reaction, but you know that it's gonna be really, really difficult. I think at the same time, I also, I know some people wanna kind of rail against treatment, and I would also just say, like, we've got so many medical professionals who are working so hard, and the treatment is changing so much, right? So I haven't gone through the full regimen of chemo, because when you have incurable cancer, they save that. So they try to do kind of least invasive to most invasive, versus people who have a stage 1 or stage 2 or even stage 3, they'll do more intense chemo because they're hoping to make it go away. And in my case, when they can't make it go away, then they hold that off till later. But I think, right, sometimes I've heard people kind of blame the medical establishment for kind of these things. Meanwhile, a lot of times the treatment is what is keeping a lot of us alive. So it's complicated. But right, that part is, I think, some of the worst for most people. Maybe one more comment or question, and then I know we are about out of time. Okay, good.
Just wondering if you found positive choices in your lifestyles that support the chemo part where you're trying to get at that thing the right way.
Yeah.
The foods that
question of like, what kind of choices can you make when you're facing something really serious, and how do you figure out how to live in light of the really serious diagnosis? Yeah, I have a complicated relationship to this question, because one of the first things I read after I got diagnosed is like, one of the best ways to prevent cancer is to be a vegetarian. And I had been a vegetarian since I was 22. And so after 20 years of being a vegetarian, I got stage 4 cancer at 42, right? And so for me, I started to realize that I thought exercise, eating well, sleeping well would actually like propel me into this really long life. And then I had to go through this whole phase of like, well, clearly it doesn't matter at all, right? What I eat, what I do. And then I also got a lot of friends who were very well-meaning would send me things about like, this particular food is going to like make sure that the cancer is vanquished. And if you eat, I got stuff about if you eat fruit, it's like pouring lighter fluid on an already roaring fire in terms of your cancer. So it's like, don't eat this, don't eat this, don't eat this. And I think that one of the things that I realize is that we so want to be in control. And I had to really like kind of search in myself of like, does it matter if I ever exercise again? Does it matter what I eat at all? You know, and so I think it does, but I think we put so much on that, right? If I just juice enough and I go to enough yoga, right? I'm going to, at the same time, like people told me a lot I should go to yoga after I got diagnosed, and that really made me mad. Because I was like, I'm not gonna say namaste and the cancer's gonna go away, you know? But then I actually started going to yoga, and one of the things that was super helpful is the way in which it's as much about the mind as it is about the body. And I have a friend who teaches yoga, and after I did yoga for a while, she said, well, now you have to start going to hot yoga. And I said, well, why would I do that? And she said, well, you're just on your mat holding poses in 103 degrees, and you're training your body not to freak out. And if you can not freak out on your mat, chances are you're going to increase your ability to not freak out off your mat. And when she said that, then it started to, part of what you do in something like yoga or kind of meditation is you're practicing a way of being in the world that I think can help you better deal with what is in your life. So the yoga, I would say, is probably about the most helpful thing that I've done. So I'll be around for a few more minutes if you would like to chat, but thanks so much for having me.